We are taught that empires fall with a scream. We expect the sky to turn red, the ground to shake, and the air to fill with the sound of breaking iron. We imagine horns echoing through the streets and walls collapsing in fire. But on the night Rome truly died, there was no sound at all. No scream, no warning. There was only a gate, left slightly ajar, because the man holding the key had quietly forgotten why it mattered. This is the most terrifying truth about collapse. The end of the world rarely arrives with a great enemy. It arrives with a quiet, collective shrug. History is often rewritten to be louder than it really was. We crave stories of heroic last stands and dramatic betrayals because they give endings a sense of dignity. We want to believe that if we had been there, we would have heard the trumpets. But history rarely ends the way it is remembered in stories or films. More often, it ends quietly, unnoticed by the very people living through its final hours. Sometimes, the gates are not broken by battering rams. Sometimes, they are simply left open, not because of a conspiracy, not because of a bribe, but because no one truly believed the gates were real anymore. This is the story of one such night, when the greatest empire the world had ever known did not lose its sovereignty to a sword, but to exhaustion, doubt, and the slow, invisible erosion of belief that no stone wall could ever hope to hold back. Night arrived in Rome without spectacle. No alarms pierced the dusk. No watchfires flared on the horizon. The sky darkened as it always had, a deep Mediterranean violet fading into ink, and the city settled into its familiar evening rhythm. Lamps were lit along streets worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Heavy doors were bolted. Conversations softened over bread and wine. Rome had known 10,000 nights like this, before nights that passed into mornings with the city still standing, still dominant, still eternal. This night did not feel different enough to demand attention, and in that absence of urgency lay its greatest danger. At the gates, the guards took their positions as they always had. Their armor bore the dull sheen of long use, scarred more by routine than battle. Their shields still carried the eagles and lightning bolts of Rome, symbols that once matched reality, but now felt like echoes of a past the men themselves could barely remember. These were not the young legionaries who had conquered Gaul or stood firm against Carthage. These were veterans of the mundane, men who had stood through countless uneventful shifts, guarding thresholds that felt increasingly symbolic rather than necessary. Centuries earlier, closing the gates at sunset had been a sacred ritual. It was a nightly declaration that Rome understood the world and its place within it. Closing the gates meant order. It meant confidence. It meant that the boundary between civilization and chaos still mattered. Now the gates felt heavy, inconvenient, almost theatrical. They guarded a promise that had thinned with time. Beyond the walls, the darkness stretched wide and patient. Somewhere out there were enemies' names. Rome once spoke with certainty and fear, and now spoke only in reports delayed by bureaucracy. But the guards did not feel surrounded. They felt forgotten. Orders from the palace arrived late, if they arrived at all. Pay arrived even later. Reinforcements were spoken of in distant chambers, but never seen on the road. Loyalty, once rewarded with land, honor, and a sense of destiny, had become a habit maintained by inertia rather than conviction. Inside the city, Rome slept uneasily, but not in panic. It was the sleep of resignation. Doors were locked out of routine, not reassurance. Earlier that day, conversations in the forum had drifted toward familiar complaints. Rising grain prices, open corruption, leaders who debated endlessly while roads cracked and aqueducts leaked. No one spoke of victory anymore. No one spoke of the future with certainty. Rome was still breathing, but it had stopped dreaming of eternity. At the gates, a decision hovered in the night air, unspoken and unrecorded. It was not betrayal. It was not cowardice. It was something far more corrosive: indifference. One guard leaned against the cold stone, shifting the weight of the spear that felt heavier that it had years ago. Another glanced toward the flickering lights of the city, and then back into the darkness beyond the walls. A conversation drifted between them, half finished, about whether it truly mattered if the gates were closed tonight. After all, nothing had happened last night. Nothing had happened the night before. Rome had stood for 1,000 years. Surely it would survive one more night of relaxed vigilance. And so the iron stayed still. The hinges did not turn. The gates remained open. They were not thrown wide in surrender, and they were not abandoned in fear. They were simply unattended in the way that matters most, the psychological way. No one rushed to secure the latches. No one felt the old, instinctive urgency that once would have driven a Roman soldier to die, rather than neglect his post. The belief that the gates were essential had evaporated long before the wood and iron were left unguarded. This was the true collapse, though no one recognized it at the time. Rome did not fall because it was overpowered by a superior force. It fell because it no longer believed in the meaning of its own defenses. The walls still stood high. The stone was still solid. The iron was still strong. But the reason for closing them had quietly disappeared. Outside the walls, the night waited. History is patient. It does not rush when time has already done the heavy lifting. The forces gathered beyond Rome did not see the open gates as a miracle. They saw them as confirmation. Proof that the stories were true, that vigilance had rotted, that certainty had thinned. They moved cautiously, because even a dying empire casts a long shadow. But step by step, they crossed a boundary that had once been unthinkable, not because the stone was gone, but because the belief that gave the stone its power had vanished. Inside the city, time fractured. Sleep came and went in uneasy waves. Rome no longer dreamed of conquest. It dreamed of stability. The fear that haunted its people was not invasion, but change. Change demanded decisions. Decisions demanded energy. And energy was the one resource the empire no longer possessed. The open gates were not the cause of Rome's decline. They were the mirror that revealed it. As the hours deepened, small failures began to compound. A messenger delayed because no one felt responsible. A commander stayed in bed because months of unpaid service had drained any sense of duty. When the first signs of intrusion reached the inner districts, resistance was fragmented and weak. Men acted as individuals, not as a united force. Rome had mastered unity on its ascent. Now, on its descent, the idea of we dissolved into a collection of isolated I's. The sound of movement eventually reached the residential streets. It did not sound like an army. It sounded like a shift in the wind. Rome had always been loud wagons on stone, footsteps in courtyards, voices echoing across the Tiber. But the difference now was meaning. Sound no longer carried authority. It carried uncertainty. When realization finally spread, it did not arrive as a scream. It arrived as disbelief. People looked to one another, to the heavens, to institutions that had once spoken with clarity. But the systems were silent. Rome had trained its people to trust systems rather than instincts, and the systems depended on effort. When the effort stopped, the systems became ghosts. As dawn approached, the city did not wake to ruin. It woke to aftermath. The sun revealed walls still standing, streets still intact, buildings casting familiar shadows. But something invisible had shifted forever. Once belief fractures, it does not heal simply because the ritual resumes. Closing the gates after the fact could not undo the knowledge that they had once been left open. From that morning forward, every defense would feel provisional. Every command would feel negotiable. Every law and promise would carry an unspoken question mark. Rome would continue to function empires, have immense inertia, but it would be mechanical. The soul had left the machine. In the weeks and years that followed, the truth of that night spread quietly, not as rumor, but as understanding. The gates had been left open because the people inside no longer believed there was anything worth closing them for. Governors hesitated, commanders delayed, Citizens obeyed out of habit, not faith. Power began to leak away from the center toward the edges. History would later try to assign blame, because blame is comforting. A corrupt official, a careless commander, a foreign invader. But blame avoids the deeper truth. The gates were not left open by one man's failure. They were left open by a civilization exhausted by its own greatness. Rome had spent centuries insisting it was eternal. When that lie became too heavy to carry, the city set it down quietly, in the dark, and went to sleep. The world did not end that night. It simply changed direction. The night the Roman gates were left open was not the moment Rome fell, but the moment Rome stopped trying to prevent the fall. And once an empire reaches that point, history no longer needs to force its way in. It just walks through the front door. Look at the gates in your own life, the boundaries, standards, and systems you've stopped defending because you're tired. Decline doesn't begin with catastrophe. It begins the first time you decide that something no longer matters.